Picture this moment frozen in time somewhere along the muddy trenches of war-torn Europe during the darkest days of World War II. A young German soldier, barely 20 years old, his uniform stained with dirt and blood, his face gaunt from weeks of scarce rations, stands in complete disbelief as he watches American prisoners being searched. From their pockets and packs tumble not just weapons and ammunition, but something that seems almost impossible, something that belongs to a different world entirely. Chocolate bars. Real chocolate, wrapped in neat brown paper, handed out by their military as standard rations, as casually as bullets and bandages. The German soldier reaches down and picks up one of these bars with trembling fingers, turning it over in his hands as if holding a treasure from another planet. His mind cannot comprehend what he is seeing. While he and his brothers in arms have been surviving on stale bread, watery soup, and whatever they could scavenge from the frozen ground, the enemy soldiers had been eating chocolate as part of their daily meals. This single moment, repeated thousands of times across battlefields from Normandy to the Rhine, from North Africa to the Italian mountains, would become one of the most powerful symbols of the vast difference between the two sides of this terrible war. It was not just about military strategy or superior weapons. It was about something deeper, something that spoke to the very heart of how nations valued their soldiers and what they believed war could or should be. This is the entire story of how chocolate became a weapon of war, a symbol of abundance, and a source of absolute disbelief for German soldiers who could barely imagine such luxury existing in the middle of humanity's greatest conflict. To understand why chocolate seemed so impossible to German soldiers during World War II, we must journey back to the years before the guns began firing and the bombs began falling. Germany in the 1930s was a nation still recovering from the devastating aftermath of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the country of its colonies, its resources, and its pride. Economic depression had ravaged German families, leaving millions unemployed and hungry. Children grew up knowing the bitter taste of poverty, standing in endless lines for bread, watching their parents struggle to put any food at all on the table. Chocolate was not something ordinary Germans could afford. It was a luxury item, something glimpsed in shop windows but rarely tasted, reserved for the wealthy and for special occasions that came far too seldom for most families. Even as Adolf Hitler rose to power and began rebuilding German industry and military might, the focus remained on practical necessities rather than pleasures. The Nazi regime spoke constantly of sacrifice, of enduring hardship for the greater good of the nation, of building strength through struggle and denial. German culture itself had long valued discipline and austerity, viewing excessive comfort as weakness and self-denial as virtue. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, America was a different world entirely. Despite suffering through the Great Depression, the United States remained a land of remarkable abundance compared to war-scarred Europe. American factories produced goods in quantities that Europeans could barely imagine. American farms stretched across vast fertile plains, growing wheat and corn, and raising cattle in numbers that dwarfed European agriculture. The American food industry had already begun developing processed and packaged foods on an industrial scale, creating products that could be mass-produced, shipped long distances, and stored for extended periods. Chocolate companies like Hershey had become major corporations, making candy bars affordable enough that even working-class Americans could enjoy them regularly. This fundamental difference in resources, in industrial capacity, in the very concept of what ordinary people deserve to have, would shape everything that followed when war finally came. When military planners in the United States began preparing for the possibility of war in the late 1930s, they approached the question of feeding soldiers with typical American practicality and innovation. They understood something that went beyond simple nutrition and calories. They knew that soldiers fighting far from home, enduring constant danger and stress, watching their friends die around them, needed more than just fuel for their bodies. They needed comfort. They needed moments of normalcy. They needed small pleasures that could remind them of home and give them reason to keep going when everything around them was horror and death. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps began working with food scientists and nutritionists to develop combat rations that could meet these psychological needs while also providing maximum nutrition in minimum space and weight. They studied what foods could survive extreme temperatures, rough handling, and long storage without spoiling. They calculated exactly how many calories a soldier needed to maintain strength during combat. They experimented with packaging materials that could protect food from water, insects, and impact. And crucially, they thought about taste and morale. This is where chocolate entered the equation in a serious way. Chocolate is an almost miraculous food when you examine its properties scientifically. It contains high amounts of quick energy from sugar and longer-lasting energy from fat. It provides essential calories in a very compact form, meaning soldiers could carry significant nutritional value without being weighed down by bulky food packages. Chocolate also contains small amounts of caffeine and theobromine, natural stimulants that could help soldiers stay alert during long marches or night watches. Perhaps most importantly, chocolate tastes good. It provides genuine pleasure, triggers the release of endorphins in the brain, and offers an instant psychological boost that can make an enormous difference to someone living in constant fear and discomfort. The Quartermaster Corps partnered with the Hershey Company to develop what became known as the D-Ration Bar, a specially formulated chocolate bar designed specifically for military use. This was not the sweet, smooth chocolate that Americans enjoyed at home. It was deliberately made harder and less sweet, so it would not melt easily in hot climates, and so soldiers would eat it only when truly needed rather than consuming it immediately as candy. But it was still chocolate, still recognizable, still a connection to civilian life and peacetime pleasures. While American military planners were incorporating chocolate into standard combat rations, German military logistics operated under entirely different constraints and philosophies. Germany had entered the war with significant weaknesses in its supply chain that would only grow worse as the conflict continued. The nation lacked access to many basic resources that were essential for modern warfare. Germany had no significant domestic oil production and depended on synthetic fuel made from coal, a process that was expensive and inefficient. The British naval blockade, which began as soon as war was declared, cut Germany off from international trade and imports. As German forces spread across Europe, conquering territory from Poland to France to the Soviet Union, their supply lines stretched longer and thinner, becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The Nazi leadership made strategic decisions that prioritized certain resources over others, often with disastrous results. Fuel and ammunition took precedence over food. Weapons production consumed resources that might have gone to agriculture or food processing. The German food supply system, even for civilians back home, relied heavily on imported goods that became unavailable once war began. For German soldiers in the field, rations were basic, monotonous, and frequently insufficient. The standard German military diet centered on bread, potatoes, and a small amount of meat when available. Soldiers received what was called the Einheitsverpflegung or standard ration, which theoretically provided adequate calories, but in practice often fell short, especially as the war turned against Germany and supply lines collapsed completely. German troops were issued canned meat, hard biscuits that could break teeth, ersatz coffee made from roasted grains rather than real coffee beans, and occasional vegetables when they could be obtained. There was no consideration given to comfort foods or psychological morale boosters through nutrition. The Nazi ideology of hardship and sacrifice extended directly to how soldiers were fed. Weakness through hunger was seen as something to be overcome through willpower rather than something to be prevented through better supply. As the war dragged on and Germany's situation became increasingly desperate, rations grew even more scarce. Soldiers on the Eastern Front, fighting in the brutal cold of Russian winters, sometimes went days with minimal food, forced to scavenge from the frozen corpses of horses or steal from the occupied populations they were supposed to be controlling. The contrast with American rations could not have been more stark or more demoralizing. The first time German soldiers encountered American military chocolate bars in significant numbers came during the North African Campaign in 1942 and 1943. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had achieved stunning victories in the desert, pushing British forces back toward Egypt and threatening the Suez Canal. But when American forces landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch in November 1942, everything began to change. The Americans brought with them a level of material abundance that shocked both their British allies and their German enemies. When German troops overran American positions or captured American soldiers, they found things they had never seen before in any army anywhere. The Americans carried individual ration packages that contained not just food but cigarettes, chewing gum, toilet paper, matches, and yes, chocolate bars. German soldiers who had been surviving on stale bread and occasional tins of meat could not believe what they were seeing. Letters and diary entries from German troops in North Africa reveal their amazement and growing demoralization. One German sergeant wrote home describing how a captured American private had been carrying more food in his personal pack than an entire German squad would receive in a week. Another German soldier wrote bitterly about finding chocolate bars among American supplies, calling it proof that the Americans were treating war like a sporting event rather than a life-or-death struggle. The chocolate became symbolic of something larger and more terrifying than just food. It represented industrial capacity, wealth, and a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached warfare. If America could afford to give its soldiers chocolate as standard rations, what else could they produce? How many tanks, how many planes, how many ships could a nation with such abundance create? The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. German soldiers had been told by their propaganda that Germany was strong, that the Allies were weak and decadent. But chocolate rations suggested something else entirely. They suggested that Germany was fighting an enemy with virtually unlimited resources, an enemy that could afford to think about their soldiers' happiness and comfort even while producing weapons in numbers that Germany could never match. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, they brought with them the full might of American and British industrial production. The invasion force was the largest amphibious assault in human history, involving thousands of ships, thousands of aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Every single one of those soldiers carried rations that included chocolate. The American D ration bar and the British equivalents were standard issue, packed into every soldier's gear alongside ammunition and medical supplies. As Allied forces fought their way inland from the beaches, breaking through German defensive positions and beginning the liberation of France, they left behind abandoned equipment, supply dumps, and casualties. German soldiers defending Normandy, many of them exhausted veterans from the Eastern Front or young recruits with minimal training, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to have infinite supplies of everything. When they overran a temporary American position or searched the bodies of fallen American soldiers, they discovered the chocolate bars and other luxury items that continued to amaze them. One German officer captured near Caen later described interrogation sessions where American soldiers offered him cigarettes and chocolate as if they were nothing, casual gestures of humanity that left him confused and shaken. He had been taught that Americans were soft and weak, unable to withstand real hardship. Yet here they were, fighting with courage and determination while also maintaining standards of comfort and care for their troops that seemed almost obscene to someone from the German military culture. As the Allied advance continued through France and into Belgium and Holland, German resistance grew increasingly desperate. Supply problems that had always plagued the German military became catastrophic. Fuel shortages meant tanks could not move. Ammunition shortages meant artillery fell silent. And food shortages meant soldiers were hungry all the time, their physical strength declining along with their morale. In this context, the discovery of Allied ration packages with chocolate became almost unbearable. It was not just that the chocolate tasted good, though of course it did. It was what it represented. Every chocolate bar was a reminder that Germany was losing, that the enemy had resources Germany could never hope to match, that all the propaganda about German superiority and Allied weakness had been nothing but lies. Military historians and psychologists who have studied World War II have noted that food played a role in morale and combat effectiveness that went far beyond simple nutrition. Soldiers who were well-fed fought better, not just because they had physical energy, but because they felt cared for by their nation and their command structure. The knowledge that someone back home was thinking about their welfare, ensuring they had not just adequate but good food, created loyalty and determination that could not be manufactured through propaganda or threats. The United States military understood this instinctively. American commanders knew that soldiers who felt abandoned or neglected would not fight as effectively as soldiers who felt valued. The inclusion of chocolate and other comfort items in combat rations was a deliberate strategic decision based on this understanding. It cost relatively little in terms of resources, but provided enormous returns in terms of morale and fighting spirit. For German soldiers, the opposite dynamic was at work. As rations became scarcer and more inadequate, as hunger became a constant companion, soldiers began to feel that their leadership did not care whether they lived or died. The Nazi regime's ideology of sacrifice and hardship, which might have been inspiring in the early days of German victories, became bitter and hollow when soldiers were starving while their officers still ate well. The contrast with American rations, particularly the presence of luxury items like chocolate, drove home the point that German soldiers were being used and discarded rather than valued and cared for. Captured German soldiers frequently mentioned food when questioned by Allied interrogators. They talked about their amazement at how well Allied troops were fed, how even prisoners of war received better rations in Allied camps than German soldiers received in the field. This information spread through the German military grapevine, reaching soldiers still fighting and further eroding their will to continue. The chocolate bars became legendary, discussed in foxholes and trenches across Europe, a symbol of everything Germany lacked and everything the Allies possessed in abundance. Some German soldiers began to see surrender not as defeat, but as escape from hunger and privation, a chance to finally eat properly, and perhaps even taste the mythical American chocolate they had heard so much about. In December 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West, a desperate attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had assembled his remaining reserves of men and material, scraped together enough fuel for a surprise attack, and aimed to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. For a brief moment, it seemed Germany might achieve a miracle victory. German forces, moving under cover of bad weather that grounded Allied aircraft, achieved complete surprise and drove deep into American lines. Thousands of American soldiers were surrounded and cut off. The fighting was brutal, conducted in freezing winter weather that added frostbite and hypothermia to the list of horrors soldiers faced. Yet even in this moment of German tactical success, the underlying problems remained unchanged. German soldiers advancing through captured American positions found supply dumps that contained luxuries they could barely believe. One German account describes an entire warehouse filled with rations, including crates of chocolate bars stacked to the ceiling. The German troops, half-starved after weeks of inadequate food, fell on these supplies with desperate hunger, eating until they were sick, filling their packs and pockets with food including as much chocolate as they could carry. For a few days, as the German offensive pushed forward, these soldiers ate better than they had in years. They tasted not just American chocolate but canned fruit, meat, coffee, and other foods they had almost forgotten existed. But this abundance was temporary and ultimately contributed to the failure of the offensive. German soldiers who should have been fighting stopped to loot American supply dumps, unable to resist the temptation of real food after so long with so little. German commanders lost control of their troops as men scattered to search for food rather than maintaining unit cohesion and pressing the attack. When the weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned to the skies, when American reinforcements arrived and began pushing the Germans back, the brief moment of plenty ended. German soldiers retreated, carrying what chocolate and other food they could, but knowing that once these captured supplies were gone, they would return to hunger and scarcity. The Battle of the Bulge ended in complete failure for Germany, with enormous casualties and the loss of equipment and men that Germany could not replace. Among the survivors, the memory of those few days eating American rations remained vivid, a tantalizing glimpse of abundance that made their return to German rations even harder to bear. While German soldiers in the West were encountering American chocolate and being amazed by Allied abundance, the situation on the Eastern Front was even more extreme and terrible. German forces fighting in the Soviet Union faced conditions that went beyond scarcity into outright starvation. The vast distances of Russia, the terrible roads, the harsh climate, and the determination of Soviet resistance combined to create a logistical nightmare for German supply officers. German soldiers in Russia often received no rations at all for days at a time, forced to forage, steal from civilians, or simply go hungry. The Nazi policy of racial warfare meant that German forces showed no mercy to Soviet civilians and felt entitled to take whatever they wanted, but even brutal theft could not compensate for the complete breakdown of German supply lines. Soldiers froze to death while retreating through winter landscapes. They starved in encircled positions, eating their horses and then eating nothing. The concept of chocolate as a ration would have seemed like a fantasy from another universe to these men. Soviet soldiers, for their part, received rations that were basic but generally adequate when supply lines functioned. The Soviet Union prioritized feeding its army even when civilians starved, understanding that the military was the only thing standing between the nation and complete destruction. Soviet rations included bread, soup, porridge, and occasional meat, along with vodka to help soldiers cope with the horror and cold. There was nothing luxurious about Soviet military food, but it was usually sufficient to keep soldiers alive and fighting. The Red Army also received supplies from the United States through the Lend-Lease program, including some American ration items. Soviet soldiers thus sometimes had access to American canned goods, chocolate, and other products that German soldiers could only dream about. When German and Soviet forces met in battle, when prisoners were taken and positions overrun, German soldiers were sometimes shocked to find American products in Soviet supply dumps. The realization that the United States was producing enough food to supply not just its own forces, but also the Soviet army hammered home just how outmatched Germany was in terms of industrial capacity and resources. The war on the Eastern Front became a war of annihilation where normal rules and normal human considerations ceased to apply. In this context, the idea of military chocolate rations was so absurd as to be almost incomprehensible. Yet German soldiers who were transferred from the Eastern Front to the West, or who heard stories from comrades fighting in different theaters, learned about the American chocolate and the vast difference in how different armies treated their soldiers. The fighting in Italy from 1943 through 1945 provided another theater where German soldiers encountered Allied material superiority in general and American rations in particular. After the Allied invasion of Sicily and then mainland Italy, German forces conducted a fighting retreat up the Italian peninsula, making the Allies pay for every mile with blood and time. The mountainous terrain of Italy favored defensive warfare, and German soldiers proved masters of defensive tactics, fortifying positions and forcing Allied troops to assault well-prepared strongpoints again and again. But even as German soldiers fought skillfully and bravely, they could not escape the reality of their supply situation. Italy was far from Germany's industrial heartland, connected by supply lines that ran through the Alps and were constantly under attack by Allied aircraft and Italian partisans. Food for German troops in Italy was scarce and monotonous, often worse than what soldiers in France or Germany itself received. Meanwhile, Allied forces in Italy, though fighting in difficult conditions, remained well supplied with everything including chocolate rations. The mountainous terrain that made defense easier also made supply more difficult, but the Allies solved this problem with typical American engineering innovation. They built roads, bridges, and supply depots with astonishing speed. They used mules to carry supplies to forward positions where vehicles could not go. They airdropped supplies to isolated units. And through all of this logistical effort, they ensured that their soldiers continued to receive regular rations, including comfort items. German soldiers defending positions in the Italian mountains, looking down on Allied supply columns moving along the roads below, could see the vast quantities of material the Allies were bringing forward. When German forces launched counterattacks or infiltrated Allied lines, they once again discovered the chocolate bars and other ration items that symbolized Allied abundance. The contrast between German and Allied rations in Italy became so pronounced that some German soldiers began surrendering specifically because they were starving and knew that becoming a prisoner was the only way to get adequate food. Allied prisoner of war camps in Italy fed captured Germans better than the German army had been feeding its own soldiers in the field. This fact spread through the German ranks and contributed to declining morale and increasing willingness to surrender rather than fight to the death as Nazi propaganda demanded. While German soldiers at the front were being shocked by Allied chocolate rations, the situation for civilians back in Germany was deteriorating into catastrophe. The Nazi regime had always prioritized military production over civilian welfare, but as the war turned against Germany, even the pretense of caring for the civilian population evaporated. Food rationing, which had begun at the start of the war, became increasingly severe as Allied bombing destroyed German transportation networks and manufacturing capacity. German cities were being reduced to rubble by British and American bomber raids. Millions of civilians were homeless, living in cellars and ruins, scrambling to find any food at all to survive. The Nazi government continued to issue ration cards, but there was often nothing in the shops to buy even with valid rations. Black markets flourished, where those with money or connections could obtain food at prices ordinary Germans could never afford. For most Germans, the war years meant constant hunger, the slow weakening of bodies deprived of adequate nutrition, and the terrible choice of whether to feed children or elderly parents when there was not enough food for everyone. Chocolate had completely disappeared from German civilian life. It existed only as a memory from before the war, something grandparents might tell children about, a luxury so remote it might as well have never existed. When soldiers came home on leave from the front and told stories about American troops carrying chocolate bars as standard rations, civilians could barely process this information. It seemed impossible that anyone anywhere could have such abundance while Germany was starving. The disconnect between Nazi propaganda, which continued to promise victory and called for sacrifice and endurance, and the reality of German soldiers being outmatched by enemies who ate chocolate while fighting, created cognitive dissonance that no amount of propaganda could resolve. German civilians began to understand that the war was lost, that all the sacrifice had been for nothing, and that their government had been lying to them about Germany's strength and prospects from the very beginning. The chocolate became part of a larger narrative of deception and failure, a small but powerful symbol of how completely the Nazi leadership had misjudged Germany's ability to win a war against enemies with vastly greater resources. German soldiers who became prisoners of war and experienced Allied POW camps firsthand received perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of the difference in resources and values between Germany and its enemies. International law, specifically the Geneva Conventions, required that prisoners of war be treated humanely and fed adequately. The Western Allies generally followed these rules, while the Soviet Union and Germany both violated them systematically. German soldiers captured by American or British forces found themselves in camps where, despite being prisoners, they received regular meals that were often better than what they had eaten as soldiers in the German army. The American military provided POWs with the same basic rations that American troops received, including canned goods, bread, vegetables, meat, and yes, sometimes chocolate. German prisoners who had been starving in the field, who had watched comrades die from hunger and cold, suddenly found themselves eating 3 meals a day, gaining weight, recovering their health. The psychological impact of this experience cannot be overstated. These men had been told that the Allies were monsters, that Americans were gangsters and criminals, that surrender meant torture and death. Instead, they found themselves treated with basic human decency and fed better than their own government had fed them. Many German POWs later said that their time in Allied prison camps, particularly American camps, was when they first began to question everything they had been taught about the war and about National Socialism. The food, including the occasional chocolate bar, represented a different way of thinking about human worth and dignity. It suggested that perhaps the Allies were not the villains Nazi propaganda had portrayed, and perhaps Germany was not the righteous victim, but rather the aggressor in an evil cause. Letters that German POWs were allowed to send home, though censored, sometimes mentioned the food and conditions in Allied camps. This information filtered back to soldiers still fighting and contributed to the growing willingness to surrender rather than continue fighting for a cause that seemed increasingly lost and pointless. The knowledge that surrender to Western allies meant adequate food and humane treatment, versus the almost certain death that awaited in continued fighting or surrender to the Soviets, influenced countless German soldiers' decisions in the final months of the war. By early 1945, the German military and the Nazi state were in complete collapse. Soviet forces were driving into Germany from the east, wreaking terrible vengeance for the horrors Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine and advancing into Germany from the west. German cities were rubble. German industry was destroyed. And the German army was disintegrating, with units surrendering en masse or simply dissolving as soldiers threw away their weapons and tried to make it home to their families. In these final chaotic months, food for German soldiers became almost non-existent. Supply systems had broken down completely. Soldiers foraged like medieval armies, taking what they could from the countryside, but there was little left to take. German civilians were starving, the transportation network was destroyed, and chaos reigned. German soldiers who had once been amazed by American chocolate rations now dreamed simply of bread or potatoes, of any food at all that might keep them alive one more day. Some German units continued fighting with fanatical determination, driven by Nazi ideology, fear of Soviet revenge, or simple desperation. But most German soldiers just wanted the war to end, wanted to survive, wanted to eat something and sleep somewhere without the constant fear of death. When these soldiers encountered Allied forces and chose to surrender, they were often given food immediately, including chocolate bars from American or British rations. Allied soldiers, victorious but not without compassion, saw the skeletal frames of their defeated enemies and shared their rations. For many German soldiers, the first chocolate bar they ever tasted came from the hand of an enemy soldier after they had surrendered. The irony was not lost on them. They had fought for years for a regime that had promised greatness and delivered only death and starvation. Their enemies, whom they had been taught to despise, treated them with more humanity and gave them better food than their own government ever had. This experience shaped the memories and understanding of an entire generation of German men who survived the war. When they later told their children and grandchildren about the war, many mentioned the chocolate, the incredible abundance of the Americans, and the bitter realization of how thoroughly they had been deceived and betrayed by their own leaders. To understand the full scale of the difference in resources between Germany and the Allies, particularly the United States, we must look at the actual production numbers and logistical achievements that made chocolate rations possible. During World War II, the United States produced approximately 3 billion individual ration packages of various types for its military. These rations were shipped across both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to supply American forces fighting on multiple continents simultaneously. The Hershey Company alone produced between 500,000 and 1 million chocolate ration bars per day at the peak of production, totaling hundreds of millions of bars over the course of the war. These bars were shipped to Europe, North Africa, the Pacific Islands, Alaska, and everywhere else American soldiers served. The logistics required to accomplish this feat were staggering. Chocolate had to be manufactured in Pennsylvania, packaged to survive rough handling and extreme temperatures, shipped across submarine-infested oceans, transported through war zones, and delivered to individual soldiers at the front lines. The United States managed this supply chain while simultaneously producing aircraft, tanks, ships, ammunition, and all the other material of modern warfare in quantities that exceeded all other nations combined. Germany, by contrast, struggled to provide basic bread and soup to its soldiers. German industrial production focused almost entirely on weapons, with food production and distribution receiving minimal priority and constantly declining resources. Germany's total agricultural output was insufficient to feed both the civilian population and the military even before the war began. Once Allied bombing campaigns began destroying German transportation networks, and the Nazi regime lost access to occupied territories that had been sources of food, the situation became impossible. The numerical reality makes clear that the chocolate rations were not some minor luxury, but rather a symbol of fundamental differences in industrial capacity, agricultural productivity, and strategic priorities. The United States could afford to give soldiers chocolate because American farms produced enormous food surpluses. American factories could package and ship products efficiently, and American strategic planners understood that well-fed soldiers fought better than hungry ones. Germany could not provide chocolate because it lacked all of these advantages and made strategic choices that prioritized weapons production over soldier welfare. The story of German soldiers being amazed by American chocolate rations became part of the cultural memory of World War II, particularly in Germany itself. In the decades after the war, as Germany rebuilt and a new generation grew up, veterans would tell stories about the war that often included mentions of the incredible abundance they had witnessed among Allied forces. The chocolate became a kind of shorthand for explaining the material differences between the sides, a concrete example that people who had not experienced war could understand immediately. German historians and memoirists writing about World War II have frequently noted the ration disparities as evidence of Germany's doomed position. Even if German soldiers had fought with perfect skill and courage, even if German generals had made no strategic mistakes, Germany could not have won a long war against enemies with such vast material superiority. The chocolate rations were a small but telling indicator of this fundamental imbalance. In American memory, the chocolate rations became part of the narrative of American exceptionalism and the righteousness of the Allied cause. American veterans told stories about sharing chocolate with starving civilians and defeated enemies, stories that emphasized American generosity and humanity even in the midst of war. The Hershey Company promoted its role in the war effort extensively, creating advertising campaigns that highlighted how Hershey chocolate had helped win the war and supported American soldiers. This marketing connected the brand with patriotism and military service in ways that benefited the company commercially for decades afterward. The story also entered popular culture through movies, books, and television shows about World War II. Scenes of American GIs sharing chocolate with grateful European children became a visual cliché, a way of showing American virtue and the liberation of Europe from Nazi tyranny. While sometimes overly sentimental, these depictions were rooted in real events and real memories. For military historians and strategists, the chocolate rations became a case study in the importance of logistics and morale in modern warfare. Military academies teach future officers about how the American emphasis on soldier welfare through good rations contributed to combat effectiveness, and how German neglect of these factors harmed their war effort. The lessons learned from World War II about feeding soldiers properly influenced military ration development in subsequent conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam to the present day. Beyond the statistics and strategic analysis, the story of chocolate rations in World War II is ultimately about individual human experiences, about young men far from home facing death and discovering in small ways how differently their nations valued them. There are thousands of individual stories, most never recorded, of German soldiers encountering chocolate for the first time. One such story comes from a German soldier named Hans who was captured in France in 1944. In his post-war memoir, he described being given a D-ration chocolate bar by an American guard while being transported to a POW camp. Hans had not tasted chocolate since childhood before the war. The bar was hard and bitter, not sweet like the chocolate he remembered, but he ate it slowly, savoring every bite, and found himself weeping at the unexpected kindness of receiving food from an enemy, and at the realization of how far he had fallen from his pre-war life. Another story tells of a German officer who kept a wrapper from an American chocolate bar in his pocket for the rest of the war, as a reminder of what Germany was fighting against. He later said that he looked at that wrapper during dark moments and understood that Germany was going to lose because any nation that could give chocolate to its soldiers while fighting a global war was too powerful to defeat. There are American stories, too, of soldiers who shared their chocolate with German prisoners, or with liberated concentration camp survivors, or with starving French or Belgian or Dutch children. These acts of sharing were small gestures of humanity in the midst of industrial-scale violence and death. They represented a choice to see the humanity in others, to offer comfort when it was within one's power to do so, to build small bridges of kindness across the chasms of war. Some American soldiers found it difficult to share food with German prisoners, feeling that the enemy did not deserve kindness after the atrocities Germany had committed. Others felt that giving food to starving enemies was a way of affirming that America was fighting for something better than revenge, that the war was about defending human dignity and establishing a more just world. These debates and decisions, often made in moments by individual soldiers, were part of the larger moral landscape of the war. The chocolate bars, insignificant in themselves, became vehicles for these moments of human choice and connection. They were small enough to carry, valuable enough to matter, and symbolic enough to carry meaning beyond their simple physical existence as food. The story of German soldiers' disbelief at American chocolate rations offers lessons that extend far beyond World War II or military history. It speaks to fundamental questions about how societies value human life, how nations allocate resources, and what factors contribute to success or failure in large-scale conflicts. One lesson is about the importance of logistics in warfare. Military strategists often say that amateurs study tactics while professionals study logistics. The chocolate rations were a tiny part of an enormous logistical system that allowed the United States to project military power across oceans and sustain operations thousands of miles from home. Germany's failure was not primarily a failure of tactics or courage, but a failure of logistics and resources. The Wehrmacht fought skillfully and bravely, but skill and bravery could not compensate for the lack of fuel, ammunition, food, and all the other material requirements of modern war. Another lesson concerns the relationship between governments and citizens, including soldiers. Soldiers who feel valued and cared for by their nation will fight more effectively and endure greater hardships than soldiers who feel abandoned or used. The United States understood this instinctively and made efforts to maintain soldier morale through good food, mail from home, entertainment, and other forms of support. Germany, operating under a totalitarian ideology that glorified sacrifice and suffering, neglected these human factors and paid the price in declining morale and increasing desertions. The story also illuminates the dangers of propaganda and false narratives. German soldiers and civilians were told repeatedly that Germany was strong and the Allies were weak. That victory was certain if only everyone maintained faith and fought hard enough. The reality, visible in something as simple as chocolate rations, was that Germany was weak and the Allies were strong, that Germany could not possibly win a long war against enemies with vastly superior resources. When the gap between propaganda and reality became impossible to ignore, the result was not renewed determination, but rather demoralization and collapse. Finally, the story reminds us that war is experienced by individuals, that behind every statistic and strategic movement are human beings with hopes, fears, hunger, and pain. The German soldier holding an American chocolate bar and unable to believe what he is seeing is not just a historical figure, but a human being confronting a moment of truth about his own situation and his own government's failures. The American soldier sharing his chocolate with a starving enemy or civilian is not just following orders, but making a moral choice about what kind of person he wants to be. These individual moments, multiplied millions of times across years of war, are where the actual experience of history takes place. Decades after the war ended, chocolate remains a symbol of American involvement in World War II and the liberation of Europe. In countries that were occupied by Nazi Germany and then liberated by Allied forces, older generations still remember American soldiers distributing chocolate to children. These memories have been passed down through families, becoming part of national narratives about the war and about America's role in ending Nazi tyranny. In Germany itself, the memory of American abundance contrasted with German scarcity has shaped post-war understanding of what went wrong and why Germany lost. German economic and political thinking after the war emphasized prosperity, stability, and integration with the West partly as a reaction to the deprivation and chaos of the Nazi years. The idea that a successful society should be able to provide not just necessities, but comforts and pleasures for all its citizens, not just elites, represented a rejection of Nazi ideology and an embrace of the kind of abundance that American chocolate rations had symbolized. The Hershey Company has maintained its connection to World War II in corporate memory and marketing, highlighting its contribution to the war effort and its role in supporting American troops. The company's archives preserve letters from soldiers thanking Hershey for the chocolate bars that provided comfort during difficult times. These artifacts serve as reminders that corporations, despite their profit-seeking nature, can contribute to national efforts and become part of larger historical narratives. Military ration development continued after World War II, with subsequent conflicts seeing improved versions of combat rations that built on lessons learned from the D-ration and other World War II ration packages. The modern meal ready-to-eat, or MRE, used by American forces includes candy and dessert items that descend directly from the decision made in World War II to include chocolate in combat rations. The principle that soldiers deserve good food and small comforts remains embedded in American military logistics. The story has been told and retold in countless books, documentaries, and articles about World War II, becoming one of those memorable details that help non-historians understand the larger contours of the war. It appears in museum exhibits about the home front and about military life, where actual chocolate ration bars from the war are displayed as artifacts. These displays help contemporary audiences understand that war is not just about battles and generals, but about the daily experiences of ordinary soldiers, including what they ate and how that affected their ability to keep fighting. At its core, the story of German soldiers unable to believe that chocolate was issued as rations reveals a universal truth about war and about human societies. War is often decided not by which side has the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but by which side can produce, transport, and distribute the material necessary to keep fighting. The side with better logistics, more resources, and greater industrial capacity will usually prevail in a long conflict, assuming reasonable competence in tactical and strategic matters. Germany entered World War II with significant weaknesses that chocolate rations symbolized but did not cause. The chocolate was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was a strategic blindness that led Germany to attack enemies it could not possibly defeat, to wage war in ways that guaranteed fierce resistance rather than acceptance, and to prioritize ideology over practical necessities. The Nazi leadership believed that willpower and racial superiority could overcome material disadvantages, that German soldiers fighting for National Socialism would be worth 3 or 5 or 10 enemy soldiers each. This belief was wrong, as was demonstrated in battles and campaigns across Europe and Africa. The chocolate rations showed German soldiers that their enemies were not the weak and decadent figures of Nazi propaganda, but rather well-fed, well-equipped, well-supported soldiers backed by nations of enormous productive capacity. This realization was devastating to German morale precisely because it revealed how completely they had been misled and how hopeless their situation actually was. For American soldiers and the American public, the chocolate rations represented something different but equally important. They showed that America valued its soldiers, that the nation was willing to devote resources to keeping them healthy and maintaining their morale, and that American industrial might could produce abundance even in the midst of war. This confidence in American capacity and American values contributed to the determination to see the war through to complete victory, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. The contrast between American and German rations was not just about chocolate, but about two different visions of how societies should function and what obligations nations owe to their citizens and soldiers. America's vision, despite its flaws and contradictions, proved more successful and more sustainable than Germany's vision of sacrifice and hierarchy. As we reach the end of this long journey through the story of German soldiers and their disbelief at American chocolate rations, we must understand that this tale is not really about chocolate at all. Chocolate was simply the tangible, edible, undeniable proof of a larger reality that German soldiers could no longer ignore once they encountered it directly. That reality was that Germany had embarked on a war it could not win, that the Nazi regime had built a system that consumed its own people in service of an evil ideology, and that the enemy's Germany had chosen to fight possessed resources and capabilities that made German defeat inevitable. The young German soldier holding an American chocolate bar in his trembling hand, that image that opened our story, represents a moment of terrible clarity. In that moment, propaganda falls away and reality becomes visible. Everything he had been told, everything he had believed or tried to believe, is revealed as false. The chocolate bar is not just food, though he is desperately hungry. It is truth made physical, proof that cannot be denied or explained away. That soldier, if he survived the war, would carry the memory of that moment for the rest of his life. He would tell his children and grandchildren about it, trying to make them understand what it was like to realize that your own government had lied to you about everything that mattered, that you had been fighting for a cause that was both evil and doomed, that the enemy you had been taught to hate had more humanity and more strength than you had ever imagined. The story of chocolate rations in World War II reminds us that history is made of small things as well as large ones, that symbols matter, that the way nations treat their soldiers reveals fundamental truths about their values and their chances of success. It teaches us to look beyond propaganda and seek material reality, to understand that abundance and scarcity shape human behavior in profound ways, and to recognize that caring for human welfare is not weakness but strength. For those of us living decades after these events, the story serves as a reminder and a warning. It reminds us that soldiers are human beings who deserve to be cared for properly, not just used and discarded. It warns us that regimes built on lies and sustained by propaganda will eventually collapse when reality becomes impossible to ignore. And it teaches us that in the end, the societies that value human life and human dignity, that can provide not just necessities but also small comforts like chocolate to their citizens and soldiers, are the societies most likely to prevail when conflict comes. The German soldiers who could not believe chocolate was issued as rations were witnessing the end of one world and the beginning of another. They were seeing the defeat of fascism and the triumph of democratic capitalism, the failure of autarky, and the success of international trade and cooperation, the collapse of a system built on cruelty, and the vindication of systems built on basic human decency. That they saw all this in something as simple as a chocolate bar makes the story no less profound, but rather more so, because it shows how even the smallest things can carry the largest meanings when circumstances give them symbolic weight.